The entire history of the Cold War in 12 minutes. In the early 1940s, while World War II was raging in Europe and Asia, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union were meeting regularly at a place called Tehran. No, not Tehran. Tehran. There, they would discuss how to solve the problems of the post-war world, including what to do with Germany and what to do with Austria. They all agreed that Germany needed to be occupied and divided into zones controlled by each of the Allies. But when it came to Austria, the three big powers couldn't agree. The British and Americans wanted to occupy Austria too, but the Soviets did not. The US and UK wanted to divide Austria into occupation zones, just like Germany, but the USSR felt that Austria was their zone already. The end of World War II found Austria still occupied by German troops. So Moscow argued that because they were the first to liberate Austria from the Germans, they had the right to keep it under Soviet control. Washington and London said no way. We want to occupy Austria too. And so the question of who would control Austria became an early flashpoint between the two superpowers. But then, something strange happened. He allowed the US, UK, and France to occupy Austria, and even allowed them to merge their occupation zones into one single Western Austria. So why did he do this? Well, there are two possible answers. First, Stalin may have been trying to get the US and UK to accept the division of Germany in exchange for withdrawing his troops from Austria. Or second, Stalin might have simply been looking out for his own interests. You see, Eastern Austria contained many ethnic Russians and Ukrainians who would be happy to live under Soviet rule. But Western Austria contained few ethnic minorities that Moscow could use to create buffer states. So it seems that Stalin didn't care about Austria itself, but only cared about having access to these minorities. Once the West agreed to occupy Austria, Stalin felt no need to keep arguing. After all, he got exactly what he wanted. And so, in 1945, the four powers met together in the city of Potsdam to sort out the future of Europe. Now, if you think those meetings went well because of the Austrian incident, you'd be wrong. You see, the Potsdam Conference is famous for being one of the worst meetings between the Allies during the Cold War. It was here that the divisions over liberated Europe quickly emerged. The main issue was again the future of Central and Eastern Europe. The Western Allies wanted free elections in these countries, while the USSR demanded that their governments must be friendly to the communists, i.e., friendly to Moscow. This disagreement over Eastern Europe would grow larger, eventually turning into an iron curtain. And yet, despite all those disagreements, the Big Three did manage to find common ground over one critical issue, namely, what to do with Germany. The three leaders agreed to split up Germany into 4 occupation zones and to prevent any resurgence of German militarism. They would demilitarize the country and remove its army, and thus, with that, the Cold War began. Germany has historically been the center of power in Europe. If you controlled Germany, you controlled the continent. That's why France used to fear a powerful Habsburg monarchy in the 17th century, or why Napoleon was able to conquer much of Europe in the 19th century, or why Germany was able to start 2 devastating world wars in the 20th century. It's hard to overstate just how important Germany was. Yet after World War II, the once great German Empire was turned into a set occupied territories, each controlled by one of the 4 victors. Germany would go on to become the most important battleground of the entire Cold War. The nation was divided into 2 separate states, the Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the German Democratic Republic in the east. In addition, every major decision had to be approved by the 4 powers. So much for German sovereignty. And yet, the Germans themselves were eager to prove themselves innocent and to show the world that they had learned from their Nazi past. They took part in protests against the hated occupying forces and enthusiastically joined the new alliance system being put together by the victorious powers. By the late 1940s, every West German wanted to join the United States sphere of influence, while every East German wanted to join the USSR sphere of influence. Yes, that's right. Before the Berlin Crisis of 1961, there was a massive amount of East Germans sneaking into West Berlin. Okay, now let's talk about nuclear weapons. Just as Germany was the key to winning World War II, it would also be the key to winning the Cold War. As the war wound down, the 3 allies began fighting over who would get to keep their armies inside post-war Germany. Each side was reluctant to leave because each side wanted to protect their respective zones of occupation. But leaving armies in place raised a new problem. All those troops would need food and supplies and other necessities. What if the Germans refused to give them to the occupying powers? Well, that's where nuclear weapons come in. By the end of 1945, the US was the only country on Earth with nuclear weapons. And so, Washington gave London and Moscow the choice. Withdraw your armies from Germany, or we'll keep supplying your troops through our zones. Unsurprisingly, neither the British nor the French wanted to leave. Germany and both the British and French zones of occupation relied heavily on the agricultural productivity of the West. And since the West was occupied by the United States, relying on the Americans for food made perfect sense for the Soviets. They could afford to pull back their troops from Germany, because doing so would endanger their access to the rich resources of Eastern Europe. Plus, they were worried that the other three powers might take advantage of their absence and turn Germany into another France. France being the only European state to escape occupation, you see. So, with the threat of nuclear weapons hanging over their heads, the British and French decided to stay. And with that, the seeds of the Western Alliance were planted. And that NATO was formed in 1949. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization consisted of the United States, the United Kingdom, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and France. Together, they created a powerful alliance that deterred any Soviet attack on Western Europe. Moscow responded to NATO by forming their own alliance in 1955, the Warsaw Pact. The members of the Warsaw Pact included the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. Of course, the USSR was the most powerful member of the pact, meaning that it effectively dominated all of Eastern Europe. And that is when things really started to heat up. In 1953, Stalin died, and soon afterwards, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev denounced Stalin's crimes. His denunciation shocked the communist world and sparked a period known as de-Stalinization. During this time, many of Stalin's former allies and enemies were rehabilitated. Millions of people were released from prison and executed. Political prisoners were given modest trials, and the secret police were dramatically scaled back. Even the name of the USSR changed to the Russian SFSR, or the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. In essence, Khrushchev tried to present the Soviet Union as more democratic and less autocratic. And yet, that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Khrushchev was willing to risk war with the West over issues that his predecessor would have ignored. Take, for example, the launch of Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik was the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. And although it wasn't that useful, it did send shockwaves across the United States. Many Americans feared that the Soviet Union was about to launch missiles from space, raining down bombs across America. This fear, combined with the perceived threat posed by communism, led to the creation of NASA and the beginning of the space race. Sputnik made the Cold War much more competitive. But Sputnik wasn't the only challenge that Khrushchev brought. In 1955, he visited the United States and gave an infamous speech in which he pounded on a shoe and threatened war. The speech was supposed to convince Americans that the Soviets were dangerous and that they should improve their relations with the USSR. But the speech actually had the opposite effect. It only proved to Americans how aggressive the Soviet Union could be. And when Khrushchev proposed a summit meeting in 1959, President Eisenhower saw it as a chance to remind the Soviets just how powerful the United States was. The two leaders met in a small town called Camp David, where they spent hours playing golf together. All the while, Eisenhower hoped that Khrushchev would be impressed by the sprawling facilities and equipment required for the president's favorite pastime. But the Soviet leader wasn't impressed at all. He complained that the American cabins were full of luxury items, and that the hotel rooms were far too large. As far as Khrushchev was concerned, these expensive hobbies were a waste of valuable American resources that could be used to build up the economy instead. And so, the summit ended in failure, and the Cold War continued. Then, in 1962, it nearly became hot. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. And the story of how it almost escalated into Armageddon is worth telling. Okay, so you know how I said earlier that the Soviets could afford to pull back their troops from Germany because they relied on Eastern Europe for resources. Well, the same thing was true for Cuba. You see, the U.S. had established a naval blockade around Cuba. And since most of Cuba's trade went through these waters, the embargo hurt the Cuban economy badly. At the same time, the U.S. was also supporting a massive propaganda campaign designed to undermine Fidel Castro's regime. Facing economic sanctions, constant propaganda, and a failing economy, Castro desperately reached out to the Soviet Union for help. And Moscow eagerly accepted the opportunity to establish a base in the Western Hemisphere. In 1962, the U.S. discovered these missiles and immediately imposed a naval blockade on the island. For 13 very tense days, the world waited for Castro and Khrushchev to decide whether to defy the Americans or back down. In the end, they chose to back down, but not without setting some important precedents. Both sides had learned a lot from the confrontation. The Americans realized that the Soviets weren't bluffing, and the Soviets realized that the Americans would fight back. That meant that nobody would try to win a nuclear war anymore, but it also meant that neither side would ever trust each other again. So with that, the world entered a period known as refers to the easing of Cold War tensions during the 1970s. This policy of lessening tensions was pursued by both the Americans and the Soviets. Richard Nixon famously traveled to China in 1972, thus opening relations between the two nations. And 2 years later, he signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviet Union, known as SALT I. This treaty limited the number of missiles each side could have, thereby reducing the chances of a nuclear war. Lasted until 1979, when the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan reignited the Cold War. And it would be long before the two superpowers went from competing economically and militarily to actively fighting each other. That's right, they said, fighting each other. From the 1950s to the 1980s, the two superpowers never fought directly. But during the 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and the United States invaded Grenada. Then, in 1983, Ronald Reagan took office in the U.S. and began ramping up defense spending. By 1984, the U.S. was spending $1.4 trillion a year on its military. To make matters worse, the Soviet economy was terrible. The arms race with the United States was draining the Soviet treasury. By the end of the decade, the USSR was bankrupt. And so, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power, promising radical reform. His first order was to stop the arms race. Soon afterwards, he began pulling Soviet troops out of Afghanistan and Eastern Europe. That left the nations of Eastern Europe free to pursue democracy and capitalism. And before long, the Iron Curtain was completely dismantled. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. With that, the Cold War was over. So there you have it, the entire history of the Cold War in just 12 minutes. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more fun history. And thank you for watching.